Welcome back to another episode of the Be the CEO of Your Life and Business podcast. This week, Amy and I are in a little bit of a different location. We're in my office because our conference room was not available. So if you're watching us on YouTube, it looks a tiny bit different in the background. But this week, we want to talk about something that Amy and I have been talking about personally, which is perspective. And this has come into play for me over the last couple of weeks. First, of course, I heard about it on Ed Milet's podcast. What else is new? He did an episode with Brendan Burchard, and they were talking about busy season, and which many of us are in right now.
We know about that.
Oh, and I mean, it's so busy. So one of the things they talked about, which really hit home for me, was perspective. And I think it's so important when especially when you're in a stressful time like this, to think about, whether you can change your perspective about certain things to make them less stressful.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of saying, which Amy and I were just, chatting about before we started recording, is instead of saying you have to do something, say you get to do something, right? Like, I have to work out in the morning. No, you get to work out in the morning. So it's things like that, and shifting your perspective a little bit to kind of, reduce the stress that you have in your life.
And can we just talk about how hard this is?
Oh my God, it's so hard.
This is not hard. This is not an easy feat, right? Like, you have to train yourself to be in the midst of whatever it is, a discussion, overwhelm, chaos, whatever it is that you're feeling. And you have to stop yourself like in your tracks, right? And like gain the perspective, either a different perspective than the one that you're telling yourself, or what I think is even more difficult is when you're having a conversation with somebody else and you're trying to see it from their perspective.
That is so, and you know what? That comes as litigators, that comes into play. And this is so funny that you raised this point, because I was dealing with a case yesterday where I had a deposition, and the other side's perspective is so annoying to me because I disagree with them like you can't believe. And I was thinking to myself, okay, let me think about it from their point of view, because it helps to come up with your own arguments. Like, if you can, get a sense of where they are coming from and the arguments they're raising, it kind of helps you prepare to oppose those arguments.
Yeah.
But I think it can also help you in dealing with the client and helping explain the other side's position. So changing your perspective a little bit, as opposed to just saying they're wrong, kind of look at it from the other side and say, well, these are their arguments. What can we say in response? Something like that.
I think it's funny because I'm certainly not saying that this is an easy thing to do, of changing your perspective. I think that you and I have had to train ourselves over a lot of years of doing personal development work, and also just rolling with the punches of business and managing people and interacting with people. You have to learn how to adopt and adapt to other perspectives. Because if you just continue to see it only through your lens, I don't know how you get along with people for very long. But like,
so true.
For attorneys, we also are trained to look at things from every different angle, which I guess also can sometimes be a different perspective, right? Where I know people say all the time to me, like, oh, you can see both sides, you could argue both sides, right? And I could obviously, like, that's part of the training of being an attorney, is being able to advocate for both sides of the coin. And in fact, our paralegal, who's going through some paralegal program right now, she was talking to me about her moot court presentation that she has to do. And I was like, okay, what side are you arguing for? And we were talking about that. And it was so interesting. It brought me right back to law school when I was doing moot court. And I'm like, that's right. Like, I had to be prepared for the arguments for both sides.
Yes.
Because it didn't matter. It was the luck of the draw of which side I was going to have to argue. So I had to be able to switch from one perspective to another and really get in that like zone of seeing somebody's perspective or seeing another perspective. So it could be really difficult. And I think that the first thing that you have to do in trying to adopt a perspective when you're in like an interaction, let's stick with that for a second, is you have to be able to listen in order to understand somebody, as opposed to listen to respond, right?
Yes. Actually listening.
To understand, to really understand somebody else's point of view. Not that you have to agree with it. Like, understanding and agreement are not the same thing, but at least recognizing that there could be a different point of view than your own is a big step.
And that really is a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
And this applies at work, but it can also apply at home in your personal life. Like I've been actually, since I listened to this episode, I've been trying to like take a step back a little bit, even with my kids, and say, okay, this is their perspective. You know, let me try to think about it from their point of view. And it's interesting to have to take a step back to really think about, and like you said, understand somebody else's perspective as opposed to just trying to listen and respond right away
with your arguments, because they're calculated and they're planned and you know what you want to say. And we have to do that every day. We have to have prepared arguments. But what happens when somebody poses a question to you and you're like, "Ooh, I actually could see their point of view there. I could see where there's a weakness in your case, or I could see that, oh, that is a different way of looking at something." And just being open to understanding and being open to actually hearing somebody out is a huge step, I think.
Yeah. And, you know, looking at perspective in terms of this busy season, I mean, you have to just put everything into perspective. You know, because yes, we have a million things going on, right? And yes, it's stressful, and yes, we're tired, but you know, you have to maybe think of it in like smaller chunks. Like, yes, I get to do this thing this morning, but then I'll move on to something else. And just shifting your perspective about what is stressful and what isn't. Like, what is stressful to you, right? So is having 5 million things to do during the day stressful to me? It is. But you know, the alternative is having no clients and having no work.
Right.
So yes, having all this stuff is very stressful, but it's real. And this is, believe me, this is very hard for us. Like, we're not sitting here saying this is easy. This is incredibly difficult. But you know, I'm working on it every day. Even when I come in and I make my little list in the morning of the things that I have to get done that day, I will say to myself, okay, instead of thinking, oh my God, this is going to take 17 hours to do, I've been saying to myself, looking at the list and thinking realistically, okay, this is not going to take me as long as I think it's going to take. I'm going to set aside 30 minutes to do this. And you know what? Oftentimes I'll get it done in less than 30 minutes. But shifting that perspective a little bit in the morning when I'm creating my list, even that small change has been helpful for me.
Yeah. And I also really love, I think the point too that Laura's making here is just asking yourself, like, which would you choose? And the question that I always ask myself when I need a perspective check is, choose your hard. Which hard would you choose? So in the situation like Laura was talking about, like, would you choose the hard of having 16 clients calling and clamoring for you and you having to manage your time a little bit better, possibly delegate, possibly prioritize, maybe set up some boundaries with some of those people who just won't leave you alone? That the list can go on and on of all the things and all the ways that you can tackle that issue, right? Of the 16 people clamoring for you. Or do you want the heart of not having 16 people clamoring for you, and now you don't know how to have an income? You don't know how to pay for the staff that you have working with you. You don't know how to give yourselves or your kids a Christmas or a Hanukkah or whatever other holiday that you're celebrating. That's hard too. And we've seen this in the context when we were doing all of our Beachbody workouts, and all of the trainers would say, choose your hard. What is harder, lifting those heavy weights or having to lift around extra weight that you have on your body because you're not taking care of yourself, or your endurance is shot to, you know what, because you're not training yourself. You're not trying every single day. You're not giving yourself the opportunity to show up and make a commitment and prove to yourself that you can do something. You could do that hard. So I think that question, if you ever feel like you're in a rut, especially in a busy season where everything is hard, like everything is hard. Managing right now, and Laura knows this, we are coming off of a month in November where my daughter, I think, has been out of school in equal parts as she has been in school because of the holidays, teachers convention, half days, parent teacher conferences, Thanksgiving break. This month always feels like I blink and then it's done. And so the hard is we have to figure out how to manage it all. You know, my husband has days off that align with Olivia's schedule, but he doesn't get those days off for himself. He's then taking care of our daughter because
Right.
she's home too. And I know this sounds so like privilege. I don't even know the word to say.
But
It
it's
sounds, it's all relative to, you know, what we have going on. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a client now, and she is a powerhouse individual in business. I'll leave it at that. And she is dealing with transactions right now, real estate transactions right now in her life, that it's hard. Like it's compounding onto an already very difficult career that she has. And but again, she's like, picking her hard. What would she prefer to do right now? Would she prefer to not have this opportunity for growth for her family? Or would she like to just like stay stuck where she is and not see the opportunity through?
Yeah.
So it is all relative. But I think asking yourself that question, and like that's the first step, right?
Yeah.
Always ask
Asking the
yourself the
questions.
question.
Yeah. And another part of it too, in terms of like talking about, you know, when you look at your day, it's all of the million things that you have to get done.
Yeah.
Change your perspective as to what is an emergency and what is not,
Mhm.
right? Because if you make your list, like, and I'm getting a lot better at this, because I think I said this last week. I have this, you see it right here on my desk.
Yep.
I'll have to show it. If you on YouTube, you could see it. It's my to do, right? So on one side it says do it now, and on the other side it says do it later. And I've gotten a lot better at putting things on do it later.
Mhm.
Because when you think about your list in the morning, you know, yes, there are always things that have to be done that day, right? But I've had to really change my perspective on, okay, what actually has to get done today? Instead of making myself sick over the fact that I can't get 7,000 things done in one day,
Yeah.
there's always tomorrow.
Yep.
And if it does not have to be done today, it goes in the do it later column.
It is so funny because this just reminded me of a conversation I had with a colleague. I was picking up a settlement check from a colleague's office yesterday. And I walk into the office, and he and I have been working on this case for a few months now. And I walk in and he just like exhaled. He like sighed. He was like, "Hi." I'm like, "Hi." I was like, "Well, this is great. We're done with this case now. This is amazing." And he was like, "Yeah." He's like, "What are you doing for the Thanksgiving holiday?" And I was telling him, and, you know, I said, it's just a busy short week, right? And he was like, "Yeah, thankfully it's a short week, but now you have to fit everything into 3 days." And I was like, "Well, aren't we lucky that we have so much that we have to fit into 3 days before the holiday break?" And he's like, "You're absolutely right." Like, it's
That
like
is a perspective
it's like a
shift.
perspective shift. It is that delicate game of tennis that you just like keep pinging and ponging back and forth, and realizing for every complaint that you have, there's some sort of gratitude that can be found. Like for
Yeah.
everything that stresses you out, there is something that you can be grateful for. Whatever worries you, there's something that you can be grateful for, which is the theme of our week this week.
Yes. So, and I think that that is really where gratitude comes in.
Mhm.
Because when you think every day about the things that you're grateful for, and I talked in a reel this week on our social media about, Amy and I both did, about
Yeah.
our gratitude practices. And so part of mine is listing 5 things every morning that I'm grateful for. And most of the time it's small things,
Yeah.
right? Like Saturday night, Mike and I were out to dinner with Chris and Kaylee, and we ran into a friend that we lived with in the Harbors like many, many years ago. And I haven't seen her in years. And Mike ran into her last week and was like, "Guess who I saw?" And I was like, "Oh my God, you're so lucky you got to see her."
That's amazing.
And then suddenly we ran into her on Saturday night. And I literally wrote in my gratitude journal that I was thankful for running into her. I was so happy to see her. But it's things like that,
Yeah.
right? That can help you get into the habit of changing your perspective on things and being grateful for things instead of saying, "Oh, I have to do this."
One of my other favorite perspective, I guess, methodologies or like challenges, I would say, is, have you ever heard of Mel Robbins's heart challenge, where she forces you to like look for the hearts that you can
Yes.
find in your day?
Yeah.
It's a way to like train your brain. Okay, so Mel Robbins is like, basically be on the hunt for the shape of a heart in whatever you do today. And people have shared with her, and I think she started this maybe during COVID when we were all like disconnected.
Yeah.
The only way we were connected was social media. And she was like, try and find a heart. And she would post pictures of like a leaf that looks like a heart, or like a puddle that looks
Yeah, I
like a
remember
heart.
that.
And it's almost like it reminds me of when you're like staring at the clouds and you're a kid and you're like, wow, what are the different shapes that I can see? It's training your brain. It's forcing your brain to look for something that you normally wouldn't be looking for, perhaps. And you also wouldn't be taking the time to actively and affirmatively look for that shape in your everyday life. But I will tell you, I've done this and I'm like, I can't help but smile whenever I see something that I'm like, oh, that looks like a heart. And it's that brief moment of just like an uplifting joy in the day. And that could apply for anything. Like you could look for those moments of gratitude. You can look for something to make you happy. You can look for even the smallest moment of smiling or whatever it is during your day. That's a perspective change.
It's totally a
It's
perspective
changing your
change.
mind, your mindset to be on the hunt for things that are good, as opposed to catastrophizing all of the things that could be going wrong.
I'm really good at catastrophizing, which I think we talked about it last week.
I think we talk about that every week.
every
We
week,
are
right.
good at it.
So
We are
I
good.
am really good at it. And even after the day that I had yesterday, I had to really sit with myself last night and focus on changing my perspective about it. Like, what can I learn from this situation? What can I use going forward? How can I change my perspective about how this
Yeah.
day went?
Yeah.
Because I catastrophized the whole day yesterday. Like I was so tired last night. I was
Yeah.
mentally drained. And so when I tell you that this is a work in progress for me, it is a serious work in progress because I can very easily catastrophize so many, and you can too, so many things that happen
Yep.
throughout our workday, especially in our line of work, right? So it really, it's a habit that you have to develop in terms of, having the ability to everybody has the ability to change their perspective on something.
Yeah.
But it's a habit that you have to develop.
And one of the last things I definitely want to touch on in this conversation is the idea that sometimes we can use almost like a guilt or a guilt trip in order to force us to change our perspectives. And I don't know, I've seen so many just diverging opinions on this, right? Like if you were a kid in the 80s, your parents were probably like, you better finish everything that's on your plate because there are starving kids in other countries around the world, right? And there was always like that guilt trip. And then in the 2000s, researchers came out and said like, that is a horrible way to teach your children about nutrition and health and, how to help other people around the world, whatever it is. Okay. That's perhaps not the best example. In a case like this though, what Brendon Burchard was talking about on that episode with Ed Mylett is he talked about this mortality complex that he has. And, he's one of the top like high performing coaches in the world. He and Ed Mylett are number top 1 2. And number 2.
Yeah.
And he says that he uses this mortality complex to force him to give him the perspective of, I get to do these things today, because he almost lost his life twice.
Yes.
And he had that second and third chance at life. And he is going to use that to propel him to make better changes every single day. And look, I think that there's definitely something to be said about that, that complex. I think there's definitely something to be said about that way of thinking, that it could perhaps become a slippery slope if you're not careful, and you could just be a little too like live each day like your last and be a little flagrant in that regard. So I think there does have to be some kind of balance. I think it's the only time I'll ever say balance is a good thing. But for him, he talks about how, he has these chances now and he's going to use them, and he's going to use them wisely, and he's going to be grateful for having those chances. And that kind of underpins everything that he does and all of the momentum during his days. So while maybe it's not, the best for, according to some researchers, I think that there is value in there of saying, you know what, I get to service these clients. I get to help these people. These people are coming to me for help. I get to do this. It's not that I have to do it. I get the chance to do it. And just shifting that way of thinking of like, what's driving you to do what you do every day.
Yeah, and I think, especially during the holiday season, it's very easy to go off the rails and be so stressed, like just over everything with everything you have to do, especially if you have kids that you have to shop for and all these different things going on, holiday parties.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much going on. Oh, on top of our job.
Oh,
So, and then
minor
then
thing.
there's that. But even if you make a small shift of like developing like a gratitude practice or something that will help you shift your perspective on a daily basis, even if you write like one thing.
Or asking that question of which heart do you choose? Which
Right.
dress are you going to choose?
Right.
Go
So even if you do one thing, right, to try and change your perspective, I think that it will help you through a very busy season. It's certainly, I mean, we do this practice all year long, but it becomes especially important in helping us shape and change our perspective and how we view things during this incredibly busy time of year. So we hope these tips were helpful. We thank you for spending time with us, and we'll talk to you on the next episode.